We have serious concerns that the 2034 FIFA World Cup in Saudi Arabia could lead to a catastrophic human rights crisis. Mohammed bin Salman has an immense degree of unilateral control over the PIF. FIFA has absolutely huge responsibilities to make sure that their event is not playing a role in these abuses.
I'm sitting here with Joey Shea from Human Rights Watch. Joey, thank you so much for being here. Joey's here to talk to Middle East Eye about a recent report released by Human Rights Watch about Saudi Arabia's public investment fund and its links to human rights abuses. Again, Joey, thanks for being here. And why don't you just run us through a quick summary of the report, going through its main findings?
Absolutely. So in our report released yesterday, we studied the Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, which is nearly $1 trillion in Saudi state wealth. We documented this fund having direct links with human rights abuses. We found that the fund has benefited from human rights abuses and that it has facilitated human rights abuses. Mainly, we found that going all the way back to 2017, during the notorious corruption crackdown at the Ritz-Carlton, Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the fund's governor, transferred 20 companies that were seized as part of that crackdown outside of any recognizable legal process into the public investment fund. Now, one of the owners of those companies, a man named Salam Muzani, was in fact detained at the time of that forced transfer and was being tortured by Saudi authorities. We also found that one of these companies that was transferred was a company called Sky Prime Aviation, which owned the planes that transferred the hit squad to Istanbul, where they then murdered Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. We also document how Mohammed bin Salman has an immense degree of unilateral control over the PIF. He is the chair of the board of directors of the PIF. He also heads the committee that oversees the chair of the board of directors. And he's also the prime minister, which allows him to appoint every single member of the board of directors. So when you look at the PIF's governance structure, the organogram, it's really only MBS there, one after the other.
A lot of people are concerned about the fund's role in the 2034 FIFA World Cup. Could you talk a bit about this? Any concerns you might have about the cup?
Yeah, absolutely. So linked to our analysis of Mohammed bin Salman's unilateral control over nearly $1 trillion in Saudi state wealth, we have found that he uses the PIF to pursue his own interests. And that includes laundering his and the reputation of Saudi authorities abroad. You mentioned Newcastle United. The PIF has also invested heavily in golf with the creation of Live Golf League, as well as UFC, wrestling, boxing, you name it. But truly the crown jewel in the Saudi sports washing strategy is the World Cup, which the Saudis have very well lined themselves up to be awarded in December, just in a few days, in a few weeks. And we have grave concerns that the Saudi Arabia hosting the 2034 World Cup will lead to grave human rights abuses. And the PIF is really the economic engine behind 2034 coming to Saudi Arabia. Sports washing, very broadly, we use this term to describe how authoritarian, abusive, human rights abusing states use their investments in high-profile sporting events to launder their reputations abroad. So instead of thinking about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the international community thinks of Saudi Arabia hosting the 2034 World Cup. This also, in addition to laundering reputations, can also be used as an important tool of soft power abroad to further Saudi Arabia's interests internationally.
I noticed Human Rights Watch recently wrote about their concerns over the transparency of the bidding process and the human rights assessment process. Do you think that this assessment was thorough? Do you think it could have missed key components and criteria?
So in 2017, FIFA passed its own internal human rights strategy. And in the process in December, we're expecting Saudi Arabia to be awarded the World Cup by FIFA. And in awarding the World Cup to Saudi Arabia, FIFA will be contradicting their own human rights policy. They will be violating their own human rights policy. And we did an analysis of Saudi Arabia's bid book, which was released over the summer, as well as an independent assessment of the sort of human rights landscape in the country. And when we looked at this independent assessment, we noticed that they had not actually consulted with any independent human rights organizations, either international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch or Saudi human rights organizations, or even migrant workers who, may be some of the most directly impacted by the construction that is expected for the World Cup. We did the sort of deep dive into this independent assessment, and they did not consult with these important groups, nor did they really include an assessment of all the human rights that may be impacted by the World Cup, including referencing the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as other, important foundations in international law.
With the amount of infrastructure that's expected to be built for this World Cup, and the amount of tourism and people traveling in from everywhere, I imagine that puts a lot of pressure on Saudi Arabia to kind of meet that moment. Do you have concerns that within Saudi Arabia's existing human rights laws, labor system, and so on, that the pressure to build that much infrastructure that fast could lead to some harmful practices?
Absolutely. We have serious concerns that the 2034 FIFA World Cup in Saudi Arabia could lead to a catastrophic human rights crisis, particularly for migrant workers who are, part of the most vulnerable, marginalized communities inside Saudi Arabia. The one part of Saudi Arabia's bid book that was indeed accurate and revealing was the sheer scale of construction that is needed to put on 2034. They plan to build up to 11 stadiums, and the supporting infrastructure, including hotels, transportation. It's absolutely enormous, the amount of construction that is needed over the next 10 years. And of course, Saudi Arabia, their labor system is what is called the kafala system or sponsorship system. And over the past many decades, Human Rights Watch, along with many other human rights organizations, have documented grave labor abuses that are inextricably linked with the kafala system.
And could you talk a bit more about that kafala system? You said it was a labor sponsorship system.
Yeah, so the kafala system, it's entrenched in the economies, particularly in the Gulf. It does have its origins in the British mandate system, unfortunately. And we have documented over the past many years in Saudi Arabia labor abuses linked to the kafala system, such as wage theft, exorbitant recruitment fees, violations that amount to forced labor, as well as health and safety concerns for migrant workers, particularly given how hot it gets in the summers in Saudi Arabia, migrant workers laboring for many hours outside in the extreme heat, and the very serious health repercussions that come from that.
And has Saudi Arabia proposed any kind of measures it would take to address these labor rights concerns, kind of like in response to those who raise alarm?
Yeah, so they have said that they have, at least in part, reformed the labor system in the country. In 2020, they announced the Labor Reform Initiative. We did an analysis of this initiative, and we did find that the reforms are inadequate and fail to fundamentally dismantle the kafala system. And migrant workers remain to this day very vulnerable to the abuses that I outlined, such as wage theft, exorbitant recruitment fees, health and safety concerns. And as well, I think it's important to remember that labor unions are still completely banned in the country.
I wonder, what role do you see kind of the international community, rights groups like your own, very credited one, and even, sport organizations like FIFA, what kind of role do they play in kind of trying to influence and improve Saudi Arabia's labor practices, trying to apply pressure in order to make sure that, like you said, migrant workers can be treated in a way that's acceptable?
It's ultimately FIFA who is putting on this massive sporting event inside of Saudi Arabia. So FIFA has absolutely huge responsibilities to make sure that their event is not playing a role in these abuses. And so that starts with adhering to their own human rights policy. And that starts with adhering to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights as well, and other international human rights law. In terms of the international community, there is going to be a whole host of businesses that will descend on Saudi Arabia, that will be involved in many different ways in the FIFA 2034 World Cup, that will be part of building the infrastructure, that will be part of putting on the event. And these companies as well have a very important responsibility to make sure that they are not facilitating human rights abuses, labor abuses, or observing abuses and benefiting from them. It is our hope that businesses will look at not just the reputational risks of being involved in the kafala system, but also the human cost in potentially doing business in a context where labor violations are widespread. But yeah, I mean, the PIF and the World Cup present an enormous economic opportunity. And often that economic opportunity can outshine the human cost, which is why, human rights groups like Human Rights Watch have an important role to play in, publicly shaming companies who are complicit in human rights abuses.
Parts of this conversation, what you're saying about kind of, shaming those involved in migrant worker abuses kind of takes me back to the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. You also had a lot of concerns about, the rights of migrant workers and labor laws. But, ultimately the World Cup went ahead. It was, considered something of a success, despite these rights campaigns. So do you think Human Rights Watch and other groups have kind of learned from that experience?
Yeah, so for Qatar in 2022, Human Rights Watch ourselves, we never called for a boycott of the event. We called for improvements in the conditions of migrant workers, reform to the kafala system. We made very specific recommendations over the many years in the lead up to 2022 to the Qatari government and also to FIFA. I do think that in many ways, our public understanding of the situation of migrant workers was greatly developed in the lead up to the Qatar, World Cup. That issues like extreme heat, the labor abuses that I've been speaking about in terms of wage theft, exorbitant recruitment fees, the world was not really familiar at all with kafala or the sponsorship system. So I do think that was, very successful from both our role as an organization and the, many groups that we worked with in coalition in the years leading up to that, you had sports broadcasters speaking very confidently about the effects of heat stress on migrant workers. And that I see as a success. Of course, there's a long way to go in Qatar, but we did see some, limited improvements.
Out of a question of historical curiosity, you said that this system was inherited from the British mandate system in terms of the treatment of workers.
Yeah, the kafala system has its origins in the British protectorate, which is really important to keep in mind when we're wagging fingers.
That's interesting, your point about wagging fingers, because a lot of people argue, like they did 2 years ago, why are you singling, the Gulf out for human rights? They point to the fact that Russia hosted the World Cup in 2018, and it was also documented then that there were infringements on workers' rights, and obviously human rights in general were a point of concern. And obviously, there have been discussions about other countries hosting sporting events, even China, which does not seem to have elicited the outrage that maybe Saudi Arabia or Qatar might have received. So what do you respond to people who say, look, why are we focusing here and now? Why not elsewhere?
As Human Rights Watch, we operate and cover more than 150 countries worldwide. We did a lot of work around the 2008 Olympics in China. We did a lot of work around the World Cup in Russia. So for us, we apply the same standards to every country that we cover. And unfortunately, most countries in the world don't like us very much, which I think means that we're doing our jobs quite well. So I think it's an important conversation to be had about these claims of Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment. The Gulf has every right to be hosting important sporting events, important global events. They have the same right to do it as any other state in the world. But I think it's also important that those events go forwards without a huge human cost to migrant workers. But like I said, this is the same standard that we apply to the United States, to Russia, to China, to the EU, to the UK, and it's important to maintain that consistency.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us and sharing your report.
Thank you very much.